Right, so on our agenda this morning, just a bit of a welcome and introduction to the topic. And then our presenter is going to give us an insight as to how Windchill actually works, go through some best practices, and then a little bit of a demonstration. And then we'll address the questions that are posted in the chat after that. All right. So we're talking here about security, obviously, of your Windchill solution. So what are the implications of either a security breach or a hardware failure in this environment? I think the obvious one is compromised IP. You really don't want somebody else going to market first with your product. So that's a very important consideration. There's always the risk of lost data if it's a security breach or a hardware failure as well. It could be data encryption, it could be data corruption if there's been a hardware failure, which means that you might need to restore to whatever last backup you have. And there's always a risk too that maybe not all of the components have been properly backed up or are in sync. And Katlego will cover that in a bit more detail. There's also the downtime or lost productivity that occurs when you have these systems to recover. And it's long work hours to get these things up and running as quickly as possible. And then another thing that maybe doesn't really cross the minds of our customers always, but you have unplanned and extensive support required from your supplier, which is product one in this case, to recover that data. So what's the consequence of that? Well, we have a number of planned projects that we're working on as well at the moment. So when we have these situations with customers down, it does leave our resources stretched very thin. And maybe you end up feeling maybe that you haven't got the support that you really needed from us. So yeah, that's not a good situation to be in from anybody's perspective. Some of the issues that we've seen with hardware and security breaches. We've had issues where LDAP has been out of date, which is your user authentication application that runs with Windchill. It maybe hasn't been backed up at the same time as the database and all of the other components, and that can cause some issues and delays in restoring the system. Vaults, which tend to be really big depending on how long you've been using Windchill. The vaults are the repositories where all of the Creo files are stored and any other CAD files and any other documents that you might have in Windchill. Because they're so huge, it's slightly tricky to actually get them to recover fully and correctly, and it can take quite a bit of work as well. Another thing is that the database can be out of sync with the vaults. So the database is basically storable, the metadata, and that obviously needs to link to the vaults and make sure that it knows where all the files are, and those two need to be in sync. There's also been cases where the database has been corrupt when we need to revert to an older version. Once again, there might be some data loss there as well. Even the Windchill installation can be corrupted, and that then requires a fresh installation of the application. So all quite time consuming to resolve. Yeah, not a situation we want to be in. So what we want to just say at this point is that if you do have a case of a security breach or a crash which has caused some type of data loss or downtime, is to contact us as soon as possible to plan the recovery with us. Yeah, just so that we know that all the things that need to be checked and need to be in line before we can actually start with a restore. I'd like to now just introduce our presenter for the rest of the webinar this morning, Katlego Mafisa. He has a BTech in information systems, so he knows information systems really well. He's been with Product One for nearly 2 years, and his previous background in IT support and Oracle solution implementation. So really a very valuable component and member of our Windchill team. Over to you, Katlego.
Thank you, Michelle. Hi, I'm Katlego Mafisa. So I'll be going through today's topic for the webinar, which is Hackers Not Welcome. And we'll be looking at how we will then be able to secure our data within Windchill. So what I'll start with is how Windchill actually works, and we'll just look at all the different components that are in Windchill and just make sense of it a bit better. So first of all, we'll be looking at the entire Windchill environment, and the Windchill environment does consist of different components on different tiers. So we have, first of all, the database tier, and within the database tier, we have the database, the vaults, file vaults and cache vaults, and then the directory server. The purpose of the database is, this is where the application is installed, and all the data, procedures, and business rules are also stored within the database. In the cache vaults, we have all our temporary files, and then in the file vaults, we have all our Windchill objects and transactions as well. Between the vault and the database, we have a link there. The two components will then reference each other. So some data will be stored in the database, and other data will be stored within the vaults. Then we have our directory server. Within the directory server, we have our user management. So this is where the user's credentials are stored, and all the groups that they belong to as well. So the directory server runs off LDAP, which is a Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, and that runs off port 389 on the file. But we'll go into that a bit later. Then our second tier would be the application tier. In this tier, we have the actual Windchill application running with the server manager and the method server, both running there. And then we have Windchill files, which is where we'll then perform all our configurations and customizations. So whatever application and business rules and processes you have within Windchill, they'll be configured within the Windchill files. And then last but not least, we have the web server within the application tier. The web server will then give us access to give users access into the application and accessing the files through port 80 from the HTTP protocol. We then have different users accessing Windchill through their web browser, so Google Chrome, Firefox, Internet Explorer, etc. We have them accessing it through their CAD authoring tool and workgroup managers. And then other clients as well also interact or interface with Windchill through the web server. Right, so first we'll look at the different vulnerabilities. What makes our system vulnerable to hackers? Firstly, we have user negligence. Users can be a bit negligent with a bit of the things, their actions, the things that they do on a daily basis. Administrator negligence as well, insufficient server security. And then we'll just have a look at the reported Windchill vulnerabilities. Starting off with user negligence, what we'll have a look at here is just a few things that users do that they're not supposed to be doing on a daily basis. So usually when a user just maybe wants to rush to the kitchen or answer their phone call quickly, they'll just leave their PC unlocked. And this is dangerous because remember, each user logs into Windchill using their credentials, so your username and password. So whatever you have open on your screen and someone either comes in through remote access or comes to your actual physical machine, they can then make changes to the data within Windchill. Secondly, users then writing their passwords on the PC. So some users forget their passwords. Sometimes they feel that their passwords are too complex to remember. They're resetting them too frequently. However, this is not advisable for them to have their passwords written down on their PC or in maybe Notepad on their PC. Password needs to stay in their memory. Right, and then not following best practices. So most users do not follow Windchill best practices, which is, for example, ensuring that you check in and clear your workspace regularly. Now, the purpose of this is to ensure that the data that is backed up by Windchill is accurate and up to date. So if a backup is going to be taken today, it is very important to make sure that all the data or all the work that is going to be backed up is recent and accurate. Next, we have social engineering. So our users can be very negligent when it gets to falling for all these different types of scams and attempts from hackers to get credentials. So acts like phishing. Phishing is them luring you to give your access details, your username and password. So they can maybe send an email out to say reset your password by clicking on this link, or reset your password by entering your credentials in this maybe field. And we just need to make sure that users don't fall for such scams. And then lastly, to ensure that we are working on secure networks. So it is very common for users to be working maybe from home or from a restaurant. And this can then also cause, if a user is logging on to a network that isn't secure, that is a huge vulnerability for the data that is stored on that machine. Right, so next we'll be looking at administrator negligence. And usually we see this commonly by administrators not ensuring that the network policies are strong enough. So for example, a password won't be as complex as it needs to be, it won't expire, and it won't have, they won't set it so that it gets reset frequently. It is also important to note that your password should not be anything or should not resemble anything similar to your username as well. So most administrators won't enforce those policies. And then next we have weak access control and permissions. So this is looking at both Windows and Windchill. Enforcing access control and permissions on both environments is very key. This is to ensure that on both an application level and a server level, we have users viewing only what they need to view. So it is important that if a user gets access, if a hacker gets access to a user account that has all the permissions, then they can perform very malicious functions. Next, we'll be looking at administrators uninstalling unnecessary applications on the server. So obviously, if you have then more applications installed on your server, you'll have, it sort of increases the scope of what the administrator then has to monitor on a daily basis. So this will then mean more monitoring and more resources for those different applications that are running. Another vulnerability, or more vulnerabilities, will then fall on ensuring that there is sufficient server security. So it is ensuring that first of all, we'll look at the firewall. So it's ensuring that the firewall is monitored on a regular basis, and ensuring that the ports that need to be opened are opened, and the ones that we are not using need to be closed. It is important to note that Windchill does make use of a lot of ports within Windchill, but the important thing to note is to allow and disallow traffic through those specific ports as an IT administrator. Secondly, we'll look at an unsecure IT infrastructure. So to ensure that our storage array has got redundancy and all data to ensure that all data isn't stored on a single hard drive, because if that is the case, then if that hard drive crashes, then all your data will then be lost. Next, we'll look at another vulnerability will then be the network not having sufficient anti-malware software. So recently, a lot of our clients have been hit by ransomware attacks. So it is important to ensure that you at least have an added tier of security by adding anti-malware software. Most or other types of viruses are keyloggers. So keyloggers will sort of imitate or record every single key that you type in. So if you type in your username and password, it will store all those characters that you've typed and send it to the hacker. And then you have adware as well. So Windchill Windchill doesn't display a lot of ads, and that's because of the architecture that has been built behind Windchill. So to ensure that there isn't a lot of adware that is being displayed. Right, and then this is a very important one, ensuring that there is limited non-essential remote access. So via TeamViewer, whether it's TeamViewer, AnyDesk, your remote desktop application, we need to ensure that we do not allow unnecessary remote access. This will then lead to more ports being opened, more traffic traveling through the network as well. So we need to ensure that we do not allow unauthenticated or unauthorized access via TeamViewer. If you will then give access via TeamViewer, ensure that you at least monitor the personal functions. And then lastly, under the vulnerabilities for ensuring your server is secure, is to ensure that you, using outdated software. The vulnerabilities have been discovered by a lot of the vendors, and these vendors then release patches to address these vulnerabilities. It is very important to also ensure that you update the software that you have installed, but we'll touch on that. Okay, then a few vulnerabilities that have been reported within Windchill. First of all, will be that IIS isn't being used. An alternative to IIS would then be Apache, which comes bundled with Windchill. And it is important to note that IIS web services that comes with Windows Server is one of the most exploited Windows vulnerabilities. So Windchill did their part there by ensuring that they don't use IIS and they use Apache instead. Recently, a lot of Windchill users have been compromised by hackers through the hackers releasing this error message. As you can see, login authorization failed. Once they display this once they display this, what the user will then do is then retype in their credentials, and even though the credentials are correct, it will show this error message. So then they get your credentials after you retype them. So it is another patch that has been released by PTC to address this vulnerability. Hackers have also exploited the vulnerabilities within the source code by changing the source code to provide themselves with admin rights. So yes, but all these vulnerabilities have been addressed by PTC. So now that we know what the vulnerabilities are, what are the best practices to ensure that we mitigate these different vulnerabilities? We need to ensure that we look at the three important topics to consider, and that's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. You want to ensure that all your data is confidential and kept within the company. You want to ensure its integrity, so whatever data is available, you want to ensure that it is the correct data, that is up to date, and you want to ensure availability as well, that the users have access whenever they need access to perform the functions. So what are we then going to look at to ensure that we mitigate these vulnerabilities? First of all is ensuring that we have backups, ensuring that the server is secure, both the server and the client environments are secure. We need to ensure that we keep our software up to date. And then we need to ensure that we also practice security within PDM link and make sure that we use the correct, we use PDM link securely. And then we'll just look at how to balance between the two, between having high security and high efficiency. So when performing backups, we need to figure out the different, the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, and why. The who is going to be the IT administrator. So this is whoever has administrative access to the Windchill server. This is the person that will then perform the backups, for the entire Windchill environment. What is this person then going to back up? This person will ensure that they back up the database, as we mentioned earlier, the vaults, the config files, and the LDAP. And it's to ensure that they back up the correct data, and to ensure that it's also the latest available data. We'll look at when do we perform these backups. Ideally this is on a case-to-case basis. Some cooperations or some organizations might look at having their backups done daily. Some can't afford that and maybe look at having them done on a monthly basis. So it really goes by on a case-to-case basis. Where are you going to have these different backups done? Ideally, you do not want to have your backups done locally to the same machine or even in the same network. Ideally, you'd want to have your backups done off-site, remotely, so that if something does happen or if your local network does get compromised, you can then revert to a backup that has been done off-site because that network will not have been compromised. Or you could have your backups done to the cloud, maybe in a data center somewhere where it is being replicated, for redundancy purposes. And why do you want to have your data backed up? Ideally, you'd want to have your data backed up so that you can recover from it in the case of a malicious attack or data loss. And yeah, why is to also ensure that there isn't permanent data loss, because yeah, I mean, imagine working on your models for 10 years and yeah, losing all that hard work. So it is important to ensure that we have our backups in place. Right, next we'll look at securing the client server environments. How do we then make sure that we secure our client server environments? The first step will be then to educate the users. Yeah, this is to ensure that the users follow the best practices, as they are the first point of sort of access to the data. So whatever mistakes they're making, whatever practices that they are doing that are a bit negligent, we need to ensure that we get rid of those bad habits. And we will be looking at monitoring the firewall, so to ensure that the traffic that is passing through and into the network is legitimate, and yeah, to ensure that whatever alerts that are being flagged by the firewall are on them as the IT administrator. Next, we'll look at access control. So we need to ensure that we only give access to the users for the functions that they need to perform. We do not give more access than they are going to need. So this is both, again, Windchill and Windows level. So ideally, you would not want to have or to be giving a designer administrative access to the vaults folder, for example. So yeah, just to ensure that all users have the access that they need and not more. And then yeah, finally, just to ensure that we limit the access to the file explorer or the actual hard drive, yeah, by giving access to the folders instead of the entire drive. So if designer A needs access to folder B, which is on a specific hard drive, rather not give him access to the entire hard drive, rather give him access to that specific folder. Then go further to assign different security permissions to that folder. So whether he needs to just read the files in that folder, or if he needs to modify or move those folders, the contents of that folder. So yeah, just to ensure that the security permissions are taken into consideration. Yeah, then we also need to ensure that we limit remote access. So if let's say a service provider or a supplier needs remote access, rather monitor the actions that are being performed by this user to ensure that there isn't any malicious intent. And having using a VPN. So a VPN is a secure tunnel between the two machines. So let's say we want to connect our client and server environment together. So what we will do is that we will create a secure tunnel between the two. Any of the information that passes through is encrypted. So even if you do get access past that information, if you do get access past the VPN, the information traveling between the two machines is encrypted. And then secondly, the purpose of the VPN is to ensure that no one intercepts that traffic. And then yeah, best practices to use secure port numbers, so secure alternatives to the port numbers. So as illustrated here, the secure alternative to using HTTP is using HTTPS. What HTTPS also does is that it will also encrypt the data that is being transferred or that is being viewed by the user. Another secure alternative is opting to use LDAP-S instead of your normal LDAP. So just to change those port numbers and to use your secure alternatives. Right, next we'll look at keeping software up to date. So yeah, it is very important to ensure that we keep all our software up to date because yeah, a lot of the vulnerabilities that are being reported by the users get addressed by the software vendors. So the way that they address these is by releasing different patches, and yeah, all the patches and newer software addressed in the previous software's vulnerabilities. So what they address is security updates and ensuring that bug fixes are also addressed. So yeah, just to note here, these are all the latest versions of software that we need for our environment, both client and server based. So for Windchill, the latest version that's out now is Windchill 12, which will be running on a Windows Server 2019 machine and on an SQL Server 2019 or Oracle 19c database. And then just to also ensure that our web browsers are the latest versions as well. So what we can get from this is that we will get not only security updates, but support from PTC and new capabilities and functions. So next we'll be looking at security within HTTP. So as I mentioned earlier, it is a best practice to make use of HTTPS instead of the normal HTTP. So HTTPS encrypts the information being sent and yeah, cannot be read by third parties unless they have that key. So it is important that that key and certificate is being stored and installed on your certificate authority, which is then yeah, held on the network itself. Windchill also makes use of security labels. So within Windchill itself, you have different security and permissions that you can assign to the different users. So yeah, it's just to make sure that we use these security labels when using. Next, we need to ensure that our Windchill architecture is of a decent standard, and by this we need to ensure that all components. So the way Windchill works is that all the components exist as individual components and integrate with each other. So what we should do is we should actually have all these components sitting on separate machines or separate drives, so that if something does happen to that machine or that hard drive, not all components are affected. Next, what we can also note is that our directory server is password protected and is a separate entity from the entire Windchill application. So as we mentioned earlier, the directory server sits on its own. Yes, it sits on the database tier, but it exists individually. So we can ensure that we can also install it on a different machine. And then, yeah, so within the database and the vaults, we have encryption. So you cannot access the vault and expect to find your CAD information raw. And yeah, so whoever has then gotten access into your Windchill server, they cannot access your CAD data. They cannot access your CAD data without having credentials and logging into it. Important here is that we need to strike a balance between efficiency and security. So if a Windchill environment is too secure and requires, maybe 5 different methods of authenticating, you need to maybe provide 2-factor authentication and need to provide maybe a long password. It is going to take from our efficiency, whereas before it used to take, literally 10 seconds for us to log in. So we need to ensure that we strike a balance between the two. Because a system that is very secure will then take down our efficiency. But a system that isn't secure at all will make us work better. So yeah, we need to ensure that we strike a balance between cover. As Michelle mentioned earlier on, we need to make sure that we plan the recovery with our service provider, with our supplier, which is product 1 in this case. So what we'll do during the planning is to assess the extent of the damage, to see what exactly is recoverable, where the damage did occur, and maybe how far we can from what is it exactly that we're going to restore from the backups, and that is our database, vaults, directory services, LDAP, and our config files. Next, we'll go into a brief demonstration. In this demonstration is just how the encryption happens within the vaults. So I have a Windchill environment open here, and what we can see is that we have access to the actual file explorer, so we can view all the different files that are stored, config files within Windchill, and then we can also view the vaults that are storing all our Windchill data. So if we go into the vaults and we try to read any of this data, as we can see that it has been encrypted. If I try opening that file, yeah, it's just looks like a lot of gibberish. So you cannot get any access to the CAD data without actually logging into Windchill and providing your username and password. Okay, and then it is also important to ensure that we do place security on these folders as well. So ideally what you want to do is go into maybe your security tab and then provide different permissions per user. So as the administrator, this user is then able to perform all functions on this folder. Ideally, you'd want to give, you wouldn't want to give this type of control to just any user. So yeah, ideally the administrator will then have full control on this folder. Right. So just a summary of what we looked at today. We looked at how Windchill works. We looked at the different vulnerabilities within Windchill. We looked at the best practices to prevent being exploited by hackers, how to recover if we have been exploited by the hackers, or if any of those vulnerabilities have been exploited. And then just here a few practical examples of how Windchill then stores all that data and encrypts that data. Right. Thank you. That's it from me.
Thank you, Katlego. I hope that everyone watching has found something that you can do to improve your security and reduce the risk of losing your valuable data. This webinar will be available on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, so you can rewatch it there if you want to go through some of those tips and best practices that we shared. You can scan this QR code now on your screen to visit the channel. Go check it out. Look at all the content that we've got available there. We've got content about Windchill and Creo, and some other interesting content coming shortly. Yeah, and then please subscribe if you want to stay up to date with the latest videos that we release. We've got some topics coming up for some more webinars. So we've got the Stop Wasting Your Time with Inefficient Data Management, where we'll have a look at what is the purpose and use of using a PLM system, if you're not already familiar with that. We'll be looking at how you can revolutionize your design process with generative topology optimization, and a common challenge that a lot of our users or administrators face is how to manage your licenses. So we'll have more of an informative session there to enable you to do that yourself. And we are very open to your suggestions, the things that you're interested about, the challenges you're experiencing. So please post your suggestions in the chat or in the comments on our YouTube channel, and we will take those into consideration. So with that, if you've got any questions or need any solution advice, please get in contact with us. We'd be happy to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and we will see you at the next webinar.